King Arthur was an old man, the ruler of a grand but crumbling palace that stood alone in the middle of a dark forest. His kingdom had long been forgotten by the world. The palace, once full of life, was now empty and quiet. Time had not been kind to it, and the halls echoed with loneliness. King Arthur's days were spent wandering the vast rooms, looking at the portraits of ancestors who had long passed, and wondering if anyone would remember him after he was gone. One chilly autumn evening, a young maid named Lila arrived at the palace. She was hired to clean and care for the place, a simple task that the king had no choice but to hire help for. Lila was different from other servants who had come and gone. She was quiet and shy, but there was something about her that caught the king's attention. She moved with grace, and her eyes held a certain sadness, as if she carried a heavy burden. At first, King Arthur didn't think much of it. He had grown old and lost interest in the people around him. But there was something strange about the way Lila worked. As she cleaned the grand halls, she would sometimes pause, staring at nothing, as if listening to something far away. The king brushed it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. However, as days passed, strange things started happening. The palace, which had been silent for years, began to make noises. The sound of footsteps echoing through empty halls, doors creaking open without anyone touching them, and a cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, as the king sat in his study, he saw it. A shadow passed by the door, moving faster than any human could. When he opened the door to investigate, no one was there. The air was thick with an eerie silence. The king began to watch Lila more closely. He noticed that she never seemed afraid, even though the palace felt more haunted than ever. She moved through the palace like she belonged there, as if the shadows were her friends. One evening, the king caught her talking to someone invisible. Her voice was soft, but he could hear the sadness in her words. She spoke as though she was asking for help, but there was no one else around. Curious, the king decided to follow her. He was drawn to her, not just because of her beauty, but because of the strange energy she seemed to carry. What was it about her that made the shadows seem alive? He could feel something was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself from being fascinated by her presence. Let me know if you need any changes or further expansion. As the days went on, King Arthur could not stop thinking about Lila. Her presence had begun to haunt him in ways he could not explain. She was a simple maid, yet there was something about her that made her stand out from everyone else. Her pale skin and dark eyes were mesmerizing, but it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him, it was the mysterious sadness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. King Arthur began to spend more time watching her as she worked. Every movement she made, every glance she gave, felt like a secret she was hiding. She never spoke much, but when she did, her voice had a strange calmness that seemed to ease the tension in the palace. Yet, at times, he would catch her staring into mirrors for hours, as if lost in a world only she could see. Other times, she would hum a soft, eerie tune that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. One evening, as the sun set and the moonlight bathed the palace in an eerie glow, the king found himself walking to the garden. There, sitting on a stone bench under the flickering light of lanterns, was Lila. She was staring at the sky, her face calm but distant. The king approached her slowly, unsure of what he was going to say, but he could no longer deny the feelings growing inside him. "Lila," the king said, his voice trembling slightly. "There is something about you, I cannot explain it. I feel as if I've known you my entire life." Before he could finish, Lila turned to him, her eyes filled with a strange, almost haunting sadness. For a brief moment, a faint smile touched her lips, but it was cold, unnatural. She looked at him as though she knew exactly what he was about to say, and yet she said nothing. "You shouldn't feel this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am not like the others." The king's heart raced. There was something in her words that sent a chill down his spine, but he ignored it. "I don't care," he replied, his voice firm. "I love you, Lila." The moment those words left his lips, the air around them seemed to change. The wind grew cold, and the leaves rustled as if a storm was approaching. Then, from the shadows of the garden, a deep voice echoed, warning him. "She is not what you think she is." The king froze, looking around frantically. But there was no one there. Only Lila, whose eyes now gleamed with something darker than he had ever seen before. Let me know if you'd like any changes or additions. The king could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Lila's warning echoed in his mind, and despite his love for her, he began to wonder if she was hiding something far darker than he could ever imagine. The strange events at the palace grew more intense, whispers in the halls, objects moving on their own, and shadows that seemed to shift and follow him wherever he went. The more the king tried to ignore it, the stronger the unease became. Determined to uncover the truth, King Arthur began to investigate Lila's past. He sent his most trusted servant to the nearby village to gather information, hoping to learn more about the mysterious maid. What he discovered shocked him. Lila wasn't just any maid. She was connected to a story that had haunted the village for years. Many years ago, a young woman named Alara had fallen in love with a man from the village. They were inseparable, until one fateful night when the man betrayed her. Heartbroken, Alara tried to take her own life, but before she could succeed, a dark spirit took hold of her, binding her to the earth. The spirit cursed her, and Alara's body was never found. It was said that her spirit lived on, seeking revenge on those who fell in love with her, taking over their bodies and turning them into a shadow of the person they once were. The king's heart sank as he realized the horrifying truth: Lila was Alara, or at least, she had become a vessel for Alara's curse. He couldn't believe it. How could the beautiful, quiet maid he had fallen in love with be tied to such a dark fate? King Arthur tried to push the thoughts aside, but the more he learned, the more he understood that Lila wasn't just a victim of the curse, she was the curse. The love he felt for her was exactly what the dark spirit craved. It fed off love, binding the victim to it, trapping them in a never-ending cycle of possession. The shadow grew stronger with every passing moment, and soon, it would consume her completely. Terrified for her, yet unwilling to let go, the king confronted Lila. He begged her to tell him the truth, to explain what had happened to her. But Lila only looked at him with sorrowful eyes. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "But the shadow, it has taken me. You can't save me, my king. It's too late." The king's heart shattered as he realized that the woman he loved was lost forever. Let me know if you need any changes or further details. King Arthur could no longer deny the horror that had overtaken his beloved Lila. The truth was inescapable. The darkness inside her wasn't just a curse, it was a powerful, malevolent force that had consumed her entire being. The more he looked at her, the more he saw the signs. Her once soft, gentle eyes now seemed to glow with an unsettling red light, and her movements became jerky, as though she was no longer in control of her own body. The king's heart was torn between love and fear. He could no longer ignore the fact that the shadow, the dark spirit that had claimed Lila, was taking full control of her. It seemed to feed on the king's emotions, growing stronger with each passing day. The once beautiful maid had become a mere shell, her body inhabited by the spirit of Alara, a vengeful soul with a thirst for destruction. Determined to save her, the king delved deeper into the ancient legends and texts hidden in the palace. He discovered that there was a way to break the curse, but it came with a terrible price. There was an ancient ritual, a form of exorcism, that could banish the shadow from Lila's body. But to perform the ritual, a sacrifice was required, a life must be offered, a life of someone who was deeply connected to the victim. And in this case, that life was his own. The king felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he realized the truth. To save Lila, he would have to give up his own life. But the thought of losing her forever, of seeing the shadow consume her completely, was too much for him to bear. That night, as the moon cast a pale light over the palace, the king confronted Lila one final time. Her body trembled as the shadow within her stirred, its presence becoming more violent with each passing moment. "Lila," the king whispered, his voice shaking. "Please, fight it. Fight the shadow. I'll do whatever it takes to save you. Just tell me how." Lila's eyes flashed with a cold, cruel light as she turned to face him. For a brief moment, it was as if the woman he had fallen in love with was looking back at him, but the shadow quickly overtook her. "You cannot save me, Arthur," she whispered, her voice no longer her own. "I belong to the darkness now." The king's heart broke as he realized the terrible truth. Lila was lost, and the shadow was now too powerful to be stopped. The palace had become a prison of shadows. The air was thick with fear, and every corner of the once grand halls seemed to whisper of death. King Arthur knew the time had come to make a choice. He could no longer live in fear of what Lila had become, and he couldn't stand to watch the woman he loved be consumed by the darkness. But the ritual he had discovered would demand a sacrifice, one that would forever change the course of his life. That night, the king stood before the ancient altar in the heart of the palace, its stones worn by time and dark magic. The ritual was simple in its demands, but its consequences were unimaginable. The king had to offer his life to break the curse that had taken Lila, to free her from the shadow that had consumed her soul. As he prepared the altar, he heard the familiar whisper of Lila's voice, soft and distant. "Arthur, please. You don't have to do this. I am beyond saving." The king's heart ached, but his resolve was firm. "I love you, Lila," he said, his voice filled with pain. "And I will save you, even if it costs me my life. You deserve to be free." Lila's eyes, now fully consumed by the shadow, glowed with an eerie red light. "You cannot save what is already lost." But the king would not give up. He began the ritual, his hands trembling as he chanted the ancient words. The shadows in the room began to writhe, swirling around him like a dark storm. The air grew colder, and a loud, deafening silence fell over the palace. As the ritual reached its climax, the king felt his strength fading. His body grew weak, but his heart remained steadfast. He could feel Lila's presence, her soul fighting the darkness one last time, her love for him breaking through the suffocating grip of the shadow. With a final, desperate cry, the king completed the ritual. The darkness that had enveloped the palace seemed to dissolve, leaving an eerie stillness behind. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, in a burst of light, Lila's form appeared before him. She was no longer the shadow that had haunted him. Her face, once twisted with pain, was now serene. She smiled softly at him, her eyes clear and filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Arthur," she whispered, her voice gentle and warm. "You saved me." But as she reached out to touch him, the light around her began to fade. "I cannot stay," she said, her form slowly dissolving into the light. "But I will never forget you. I will always love you." With those final words, Lila disappeared, leaving the king alone in the quiet, now peaceful palace. Though his heart was broken, he knew he had done the right thing. He had saved the woman he loved, even at the cost of his own life. And in the shadows of the palace, the king's love for Lila would forever remain, a quiet memory that whispered through the halls for all eternity.